Hello. Okay, so the one-line summary is the title. So if there's one thing that you take away from the talk, please take away the title. Now, what has been said already about the whole CHI4Good, Good4CHI type of debate, which has been going on for a while now, is that there are three broad reasons why people in HCI have been getting involved in the work of global good as loosely defined. One of them is social responsibility. This is a sort of general techno-deterministic view of the world, which is that underserved communities require some kind of technology to do certain things that they're doing better. A second one is a technology adoption post-mortem, which is human-computer interaction work looking at impositions of technology which then fail, and then we as design professionals come in and talk about, well, why might these have failed? And the third is work in some form of active design in which we're doing context-aware design, in which essentially we're looking at a certain context and saying that the standard way of designing products or services might not work for this setting, and therefore we will design them somehow differently. And this is the general overview of some of the motivations, the key motivations for why CHI or HCI type work gets involved in the issues around global good. What I am saying in this paper is, first, let us think about why we think that we can do good, right? Second is, I'm claiming that we do not currently have good ways of even evaluating what is good. Third, I'm saying that we as designers benefit from good, or what is loosely designed as good here. And fourth is that there is a good ending here, is that there are ways in which we can evolve our processes to be better at this process. Okay, first is a disclaimer. This is a picture of a confession, which is that I have myself made a living out of CHI4Good type stuff for well over a decade now. I've been working in this area, and I've basically got my job and done various kinds of things as a beneficiary of this. Let me start with a definition. And what I do in this paper is first is look at how do we define the notion of good. And in this, is good a moral stance of some kind, or is it an umbrella term for a range of products and services which are designed for a population whose very definition as users implies an off-market motivation? And I'm going with the latter as the general way in which good tends to be designed in much of HCI4Good. So within this, I have created three general typologies of good work over the history of CHI publications in the last 20 or more years. And this breaks down broadly as three general areas. One is application research, which is looking at using clever design or thoughtful design to do something which is currently not being done very well, slightly better. So you can think about innovations in healthcare and so on and so forth would be within this space of now we're going to use technology and make this more efficient. Crossover work, which is where the good domain crosses over to the non-good, which is to say that work such as the keynote of Indrani Medhi, which is going on right now, which is she started doing work with how do you build visual interfaces for people who are non-literate, and is there a way to think about how that might change the way we interact with devices as a literate population as well. And this is a crossover work where the good population working for that underserved population has some kind of a spillover effect to the mainstream population. And this tends to be one of the major ways in which Microsoft Research India, for instance, they've done a lot of work in which you start with an underserved population, then hopefully that then moves over to some general product space. And the last is what I think of as community-centric research. And this is various kinds of research which have focused on trying to understand one population in depth. This is a sort of ethnographic side of CHI, where we go into one community and try to look at what is their technology environment with the goal of eventually designing for them. So these are the three general typologies of good work in CHI. Now, my first proposition, why do we think we can do good? And for a significant period of time, images like these were fairly common. You would see an image of somebody using a computer, and somehow that image would evoke the notion of good. Because there is nothing in this image, as if you think about it, there is no more in either of these images which should suggest that the population is a recipient of good any more than me wearing a kurta should suggest that I ought to be a recipient of good. So much so that the picture on the left is a stock photo. You can get stock photos of people in ethnic dresses wearing computers, such as that being an indicator of this person is somehow not at odds with the technological artifact. There's a second reason why we think we can do good, and this has to do with the image of the successful person from a developing country, what have you, who has then gone and made it big. Therefore, that individual becomes the artifact in and of themselves, where if I could move from my homeland in the global south to becoming this magnificent person by virtue of technology, surely technology can be applied in the similar way to the lives of various people. Right? So the technology as being the engine of what changes a person from state A to state B becomes a more general discourse. The second general trend of reasons I'm going to go after in this paper is that we don't have ways of evaluating what is good. I'm assuming that almost all of you have had a CHI paper reviewed in an ugly fashion or provided the same. So you have a sense of what reviewers nitpick best. It's a question. Methodology, right? We know how to oh, this methodology, this is ridiculous methodology. How shame on you, how dare you? And then there is also, of course, related work. How could you forget to cite my paper? How dare you? Etc. So, but there is an expertise logic to this, is that we know what we are doing here, and we are experts at this, so we know how to nitpick for this. When it comes to evaluating good, it's a much more complicated problem, because it's a question that are we trained as people who know good, or are we trained as people who are academics at design or what have you, and therefore that population, how well can we evaluate the value of design to that population? The second one is, quite frankly, is that the problems of good are very serious problems. The kinds of projects that we think of as good, and we don't necessarily, for the most part of it, deal with these in our daily lives. We are exempt from this. And therefore, it begs the question, is that where is how deep is our understanding of some of these issues of good, either as people who work in it, or much more commonly as people who pass judgment on whether this good work is good enough. There's the exception in this case. One of these would be accessibility. A lot of the work which is, and when I define good, I'm using what CHI4Good has used in talking about what qualifies as good work. Accessibility has been one of the big areas that's talked about as good work. And it tends to be that accessibility community is ahead on this, because there are people who deal with accessibility challenges in their daily lives who have become part of the accessibility design community. The last reason for why we do not have ways of evaluating good is, again, related to the previous point, is of the depth of involvement in good. Has people seen this Jiro Dreams of Sushi? Yeah? All right, so when I was watching this movie, I loved this movie, and there was this part about this guy who's the sous chef, and he's a rice guy. And he's been learning to make rice for 8 years. And there was a part of me which was really wow, this is fantastic. This guy worked for 8 years to boil rice. That's amazing. And there's a part of me like, wow, this is shocking. For 8 years, he just boiled rice. But there is something to be said about deep expertise in one area and how that manifests itself. Now, obviously, this is one example in a movie, but if you think about what we do in CHI as evaluating work, especially evaluating work which is about deep social problems, we have a 10-page format, which is a pretty restrictive format to talk about big world problems, and however small our work might be. And there's a formulaic format to follow in doing those 10 pages, whether you have some kind of, those 10 pages, half of those pages are taken up by the related work, methodology, and so on and so forth. The innovation format also arguably works against it, because eventually you all have also heard in your reviews, how is this designed? And you have to know how to answer that, and therefore that has some consequences on it. And our expertise might be stable, but our domains move. For a cross-section of people who work in human-computer interaction, they might start with one specific domain in human-computer interaction, but move to various other domains. Whereas a lot of people who work in development have been working in one specific subfield for several years. Last, we run on CHI cycles. So it's like, okay, by next year, I have to do my next piece of global good, and so on and so forth, which also is a significant, problem with being able to do this work reasonably. Another point about the problem with evaluating good is that we do design contests very well. I teach them in my class, for instance. But those often expect some kind of a linear problem to deal with that you have an answer for, because a design problem gives you a certain number of hours, minutes to deal with a certain problem, and those also tend to reward design rather than deep thought about a problem. Lastly, I'm going to make the case that we as designers benefit immensely from this idea of good. Obviously, tomorrow's keynote, I think, the morning keynote is about how we've changed the world. We have CHI4Good as a past thing. If people who work in UX design, I teach these classes, and I know that students of mine who can do accessibility can get picked up right away, because as a designer, you're much more competent if you can deal with diverse populations. So you're better as a designer when you can work in what we teach in Global Good. Emerging markets is great business. This paragon of romance right here is the Indian Prime Minister hugging Mark Zuckerberg. And in some sense, what doing quick, good work helps you to do some kind of development type work without really getting your hands dirty. So it's also a reasonable, easy way to do good. And in conclusion, I make the claim that we can evolve our processes to be better at this. The first thing we can do is we can actually ask ourselves, especially there are a couple of tracks now in CHI, HCI4D being one of them, where we are orienting papers around what is the impact on the community itself. So we should ask ourselves, is what I'm doing somehow bad for beneficiaries? Let's just think about it, because anybody who's done an NSF grant thinks about, well, how am I going to make the case to the government that what I'm doing is good for the society? How might it be bad? Is that something that you should think about and have as something you address every time you write a paper on this? Can we have practitioners as reviewers? It might be something that is necessary. If you're looking for expertise, these are the people who have expertise in working with this. Think about having sections on social good as related work. What other work outside of design exists in this area? How well do we know that work? And finally, to show some skin in the game. And for this, I actually use the example of Rajesh Veeraraghavan. He's a professor at Georgetown who did work on the use of technology for labor payments. And he actually ended up going and living for a year in villages in South India and working as a laborer before he went out and published work on it. And in some sense, anthropologists have been doing this for a long time. When they publish work on development, they're actually involved in that community for a significant period of time. So, this is my end game. I'm going to read this out verbatim. When we self-assign a social mission, we also appropriate ways of discussing it. We must ask ourselves whether the seriousness of the social problem will be defined, at least in some measure, by the clarity with which a design artifact claims to tackle it. Let's at least stop calling it good. So that's it. These are all the people who have helped out with feedback to the paper, and thank the jurors at Alt-CHI.
Hi, I'm Joe, sadly out of academia, but at what point do we say as practitioners, your publication, if it is targeting social good, every pub has to become some kind of municipal proposal? When do we say it's time for researchers to actually participate in policy long after their publication has been accepted?
So the shorter way to answer that question would be to actually get people who are in those roles long term to be part of your work. And Cliff Lampy, for instance, who's my colleague, who's actually doing this, where he's actively using people from the municipalities who are collaborators. They're not just his respondents. So that's one way to actually change it, is to, well, you're in the community and you're vested in this, come be part of this work. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Eric Ballmer, Lehigh University. I want to ask something I'm a little afraid to ask that might be a devil's advocate kind of question, which is, why do this kind of work in academia? If you want to have social impact, would it not be better to work at an NGO or a policy think tank or a government research lab? What's the case for doing this kind of work in an academic context?
Sure. So that's an existential question. It's like, who am I? And I feel I'm an academic, right? And I think that for a lot of the people, it's like, okay, I am an academic. I wish I was an academic for the long term. And I want to impact that in the long term, but not give up my right to continue being an academic. I don't see myself as that. So I'm not saying that this is the reason for, I'm saying this is the driver of why people in academia are going to continue doing that. I'm saying here that this is going to continue to happen. It's going to happen even with more gusto. As it happens, be more careful about how you take it out. Yeah.
Anthony Poon, Cornell University. Insightful talk and very salient points. I wanted to ask generally, you had a section where we criticized the format of CHI and how it's not really geared towards this kind of work. And then I want to ask basically, what ways do you think as researchers in this kind of work, we can improve that format, or we can find other venues that might be more appropriate?
So there's obviously, if you're going to work in this specific area and development is what you care about, then ICTD is one venue where they deal with this kind of problem. If you're interested in, say, accessibility, for instance, then you can do assets, but assets tend to be much more on the technical side. What if you're saying is that how do we stay within CHI and change?
What are the features of venues that would more accurately reflect the value that you want to promote?
Okay, so
if you were to fix CHI or ICTD or dev or accessibility, what would you do?
It's probably a longer conversation, but in short, I would say is that if we were at least able to get points like this on the table, that should take us a step towards fixing some of these.
Sure. Thanks.
So last question, is that, yeah?
Melanie Feinberg, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Hey, Joyojeet. You've thought about this a long time. Let's stop calling it good. What should it be called?
I would be perfectly comfortable calling it for the population that you're working for. So if you want to call it ICT for the people who are in some kind of agricultural crisis, I think that's fine to call it that as a domain, because we do that with several kinds of things over here where we are talking about some technology for a specific domain. That domain does not become the center of our attention. What's happening in that interaction is. What I'm saying is that there is very little that connects the experiences of farmers, fishermen with earthquake victims, but these have somehow all become part of one parent concept of good, which dilutes what is the nature of that actual relationship for that specific domain. And that's what I'm asking that we should probably move towards.